Thank you all so much for coming. I think that anybody who has looked out their window even once today and braved coming to a building that they didn't absolutely have to be in deserves prizes, and we'll take your names. In fact, if you want to sign up for IAS events and you're not already on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet right over there. And by the end of the semester, we will have figured out your prize. And I'm sure it'll have chocolate in it. But, I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and I want to welcome you all today to the beginning of the Thursdays at 4 events for the fall. We have 12 Thursdays at 4 this semester, and this one, Eyes in the Skies, an exhibition and critical discussion of uninhabited aerial vehicles, is the kickoff event. And I hope everybody got to lay hands on the UAVs outside or see Ian MacRae's video, but if not, you can see 2 over there on the table and talk to people further about them if you want to. This event is co-sponsored today by 3 departments here at the University of Minnesota: the Department of Art, the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and the Department of Entomology. So we thank them for their co-sponsorship. And I want to point out that Thursdays at 4 are regularly held here in the Crosby Seminar Room in Northrop, and except for 2 this year. One is next week, will be held up in the Best Buy Theater, and the other is October 22nd, which is a joint program between Northrop and the IAS, featuring Sean Curran, who is one of the dance companies coming in the Northrop series. So next week is the presentation is by Julian Vasquez-Heilig, who's in the Department of Educational Leadership at California State University, Sacramento. And this program is in collaboration, I'll use this word twice here, in collaboration with an IAS Research and Creative Collaboration, Private for the Public Good. And the title of the talk is What Instead? Community-Based Education Policy as the Alternative to Top-Down Private Control. And I think we're expecting a lively discussion. And the final announcement I want to make before I introduce today's speakers is that it's been our custom in the last year to continue the conversations that we have here after the talk, after the panel, over refreshments downstairs. And today, Provost Karen Hansen has very generously offered to start us off on that continuing conversation with wine and cheese, or non-alcoholic beverages, downstairs in the Surdix Cafe. So I want to thank Provost Hansen for doing that. Okay, anybody else have any announcements or questions before I move on? Well, today's presentation is an outgrowth of one we had last spring with Pete Seiler from the Department of Aerospace Engineering, talking about the increased presence of uninhabited aerial vehicles in our lives from a variety of different perspectives and concerns. And so Pete has kindly volunteered to lead this discussion today. And he is an assistant professor in the Department of Aerospace Engineering and Mechanics and a resident fellow at the Institute on the Environment. Before joining the faculty at Minnesota, Pete worked at the Honeywell research labs on various aerospace and automotive applications, including redundancy management systems for the Boeing 787. Just think, you do not want your computer to go out while you are over the Pacific Ocean. Redundancy management makes sure that that doesn't happen. He also has worked on sensor fusion algorithms for automated active safety systems and re-entry flight control laws for NASA's Orion vehicle. Since joining Minnesota in 2008, he's been working on advanced control techniques for wind turbines, fault detection methods for safety critical systems, and robust control of disk drives. So his research is really grounded in robust control theory and focusing on the impact that model uncertainty has on systems design. And I'm introducing people in no particular order here, and after we see the audio visuals, then they'll take their place up here. So Bill McGeveran is an associate professor in the University of Minnesota Law School. He earned his JD degree from New York University and a BA in political science from Carleton College. And prior to coming to the University of Minnesota, he was a resident fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. He specializes in information law, including data privacy, intellectual property, communications and technology, and free speech. And he also serves on the advisory board of the Future of Privacy Forum. And if you listen to Minnesota Public Radio, you'll probably hear him periodically, and in fact, quite recently. Jennifer Alexander.
And I'm a former IAS fellow. Don't forget that.
The most important thing, he's a former IAS fellow. Boy, I almost blew that. Burying my lead, it's called. So
you were saving that for later, right?
I was saving that for later. When you say something really brilliant, we'll claim you immediately. We have a flashing flag. So Jennifer Alexander is in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and also my colleague in the program in the History of Science and Technology and Medicine graduate program. Jennifer is an associate professor in HST, and she earned her PhD in history from the University of Washington. Her book, The Mantra of Efficiency, From Water Wheel to Social Control, won the Edelstein Prize for the Best Book in 2010 from the Society for the History of Technology. And her current project, Technology and Belief, examines the intersection of religion and technology, and particularly theological critiques of technology in times of social tension, such as the Great Depression and the Cold War era. Ian MacRae has joined us all the way from Crookston, even though he's actually an associate professor in the Department of Entomology on the St. Paul campus. But he's located at the University of Minnesota's Northwest Research and Outreach Center in Crookston. He earned his PhD in entomology from Oregon State University, but I sense there might be Canada somewhere in your root structure because...
East Coast of Canada.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense because his master's and undergraduate degrees in science came from two Canadian universities. He works on the application of technology such as UAVs in agriculture for remote sensing and precision targeting of pesticide delivery. And he teaches the use of GIS and spatial statistics to map and analyze landscape ecology and population dynamics. So you might think differently about UAV surveillance when it involves, and this is a title of one of Professor MacRae's recent articles, remote sensing for assessing rhizoctonia, crown, and root rot severity in sugar beets. So I like the idea that UAVs can help you figure out if your roots are rotting. And last, but by no means, no, not last, sorry, Cassandra Isackson, who is joining us today, has been with the Minnesota Department of Transportation for 15 years. She began serving as Director of Aeronautics in April 2013. I bet nobody even knew that MnDOT had an aeronautics division. Isackson received her Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Alabama and began her career working for the Alabama Department of Transportation in Materials and Tests. And she's held various roles throughout MnDOT before taking on her current position. And she's a registered professional engineer in the state of Minnesota. She also serves as chair of the steering committee for the University of Minnesota's Airport Technical Assistance Program, which is a statewide program that helps Minnesota's public and private sector airport professionals improve safety, quality, and efficiency of operation, among other things. So I'm grateful. Volkan Islar is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science. He earned his BS degree in computer engineering from, oh no, I should have asked how to pronounce this ahead of time, Bogazici, sorry, I apologize, I will get better. University in Istanbul, Turkey, and his Master's of Science and Engineering and PhD degrees in Computer and Information Science from the University of Pennsylvania. Among other awards, Professor Isler has been a McKnight Land Grant Professor, and like Pete Seiler, he's been a resident fellow of the Institute on the Environment, so we have to get you all to apply for IAS fellowship so we can claim you too. And both of them have received various National Science Foundation awards targeted for early career scientists and young investigators. Professor Isler works on applying robotics to challenging problems of protecting the environment, such as tracking and studying invasive Asian carp. And scaling up, he's working on applying his robotics expertise to developing a global scale environmental sensing system in which a network of robots could sense local environmental conditions in real time. So you may have think that you've now had half the panel in one introduction, but I ask you to join me in welcoming all our panelists, and we'll let Pete start us off.
All right, so I think we had a fairly informal plan for the rest of the session, which is we're each going to talk for just a few minutes. I think we'll let Professor Isler start, and then I'll go second. So I think we'll each talk a little bit about the technology and then some of the other issues about surveillance and privacy that are surrounding it. And then we'll end with, we'll have a big chunk of time for kind of open discussion and questions. I think that's how we'll plan it. All right, so I'll leave the first one.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us, and thank you very much for inviting me for this nice afternoon session. So my assignment in the panel was to talk about UAV applications. So this term, I guess maybe first we should calibrate the terms. So you'll hear words like UAVs. So these are uninhabited aerial vehicles, or UAS. So that S is for systems. So my assignment was UAV applications, but I kind of narrowed it down to agriculture, but some of the things that I'll talk about apply to other things. And then, given the time, I further narrowed it down to, robotics from a robotics perspective, which is my area of research. So if you look at a lot of the commercial activity these days, it kind of revolves around flying over a field and then taking multispectral images and then interpreting them and so on. And as roboticists, we're kind of interested in pushing these capabilities further. So here's one example. So let's say you're not a sort of a big corn or soy farmer, but instead, let's say you have an apple orchard and you want to use this type of technology. So one thing you may want to do is get one of these vehicles and then fly it in the orchard. And just to give you an idea of what's going on here, so we tether it for safety reasons. And then Nicholas, who is also in the room, has the RC controller, but it's just for a safety reason. So the vehicle flies autonomously, and we work on these types of sensing applications where we can detect the apples, count them, and estimate their diameters. So if you really wanted to have autonomous behavior in a setting like this, one thing that becomes challenging is to navigate in orchard rows. And this is another thing that we've been working on, to detect the road, to detect the obstacles, which in certain settings is not very difficult. But here's another example from just a few weeks ago. And if you want to do autonomous navigation and sensing in a setting like this, in the presence of disturbances, then all of these are interesting research problems. So I think as a general application, UAVs in specialty orchards like apple orchards, there's a lot of technical work to be done, but also a lot of potential. I'll just go very quickly. I just want to give some examples. And another example I want to show you is what if you had footage like this one? So rather than high altitude, fixed altitude, but if you had somebody taking images like this. So this is the specific camera motion. So the camera lifts up, turns around. Now when you have this type of data, even some of the simple looking applications like building an image mosaic become challenging. So this is another thing that we have been working on. So we can build mosaics even with this type of motion. And let me just quickly tell you. So the reason the resolution here is not as good is actually, if you recall from the footage, the cameras saw that part only briefly from a very small angle, but then putting it into the same coordinate frame where you have high resolution here and so on requires actually figuring out what the UAV did and extracting its motion. And then another issue I think is to go beyond pixels and to understand the geometry of the environment. So in this case, what if we want information about the rows themselves? How many rows are there? You know, what's the distance between them? What's the geometry of the rows? Or in the case of apples, if you start reasoning about, you know, apples, their distributions and so on, in a way you kind of need to understand, and I'm using the word understand on purpose here, not just, you know, measure things, but figure out what thing that you're looking at actually corresponds to. So with this, I think if you want to use these vehicles in more sophisticated settings, sensing is going to remain a big challenge, and then planning and controls are also, of course, fundamental problems. And at the intersection of these two problems, one is obstacle avoidance. Like if you really wanted to go from here to the exit of this building, avoiding obstacles, which could be stationary things, but as well humans, and you have to go around them, predict their motion. And then active sensing is an area that we're working on actively, which refers to, rather than taking a set of images as given, suppose you could control the camera and figure out where these images should be taken from. So then this coupling between, you know, robotics and sensing is an interesting problem. I think one thing that's going to be big is coordination with other vehicles. This could be other flying vehicles, but vehicles with complementary capabilities. For example, a farmer could actually have his tractor, and then as needed, the UAV can take off from the tractor and then come back and recharge and do these kinds of things. So we have some work in this area. And the thing that's, you know, these days any computer science talk must mention big data. And in our case, big data is a big problem, because even taking high resolution images directly from the camera to a computer, you hit this problem. And I think there's no generic brute force way of handling this, and this type of processing at the front end, extracting some information, pushing it to the server is going to be important. But I'll just stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
So we'll run through all the presentations serial fashion. I think we'll do the questions and discussion at the end. So I'll go next. I'm Pete Seiler. So I'll also just give maybe a short overview. Maybe I'll start, Volkan did a nice job just kind of, we have our own lingo. Generally we don't say drones, I guess, in the sense that you think of drone strikes or things like that. So uninhabited aerial vehicles or uninhabited aerial systems, one thing you'll notice is in the videos that Volkan showed, if you were kind of out before the panel, there were two that we had on display that are over on the far kind of table. His was more like a helicopter style configuration, as opposed to what I'll talk a little bit about our standard kind of conventional fixed wing aircraft. I would say the basic trade-off there is just the ability to hover. So if you want to hover and look closely at something, you'd have something more like the videos that Volkan showed, something that can kind of take off and land vertically. If you want to, but the drawback of having a configuration like that is it's not as energy efficient as having a fixed wing aircraft. So if you have an application where you want to fly for a long time, I want to do surveillance on a pipeline over many states. I need to fly for a long period of time. Then a fixed wing aircraft would be the preferable choice. Okay. So in our lab, we look at these small unmanned aerial vehicles or uninhabited aerial vehicles. We look at fixed wing, as I said. I'll say a little bit about this aircraft. I'll just acknowledge some of the people that I work with. Professor McGeveran is on travel, but he's one of my colleagues. Professor Ballas actually started the lab. We've got a whole series of different fixed-wing aircraft of different types, and Brian Taylor and Chris Regan are the lab directors who handle things kind of from the day-to-day point of view. All right, so this is what I was mentioning. If you say the term drone, I think what comes to mind in the news are probably things like the Predator or Global Hawk. These are very large airframes, not much smaller than what you might have if you're flying on a commercial aircraft. These smaller uninhabited aerial vehicles, they range in size, but generally what we're working on in our lab are things that are about the dimension of the aircraft that's on that far table over there. 10 to 12 feet in wingspan or less. Generally they're aircraft that can be remotely piloted, but they can also be autonomous, meaning the pilot's not flying anymore, and there's a switch and the aircraft's flying itself. And autonomous here has kind of many layers of meaning. It may just mean the aircraft you're given it a sequence of points and it's flying around some points. But a more higher level version of autonomy would be something like something broke on the aircraft. Can the aircraft on its own figure out what's broken and continue flying? Okay? When you get on an airplane, a commercial aircraft, and you're flying from point A to point B, the aircraft has lots of functionality or redundancy that keeps the airplane flying even when something breaks. And we'd like to have these smaller aircraft have some level of that autonomy. In terms of applications, Volkan already talked about precision agriculture. A fixed-wing version of a precision agriculture aircraft would be something like this. This is the Centerio Vireo. Centerio is a company that's in town. They build this airframe, and it's meant to be, fly over a field or a farmer's land. You can see there's a camera and take some data and then try to make some inferences about, what the farmer should do over their land. Package delivery, that's the upper left block. You may have heard of Amazon trying to do door-to-door delivery. That's their concept. Oceanography, or studying, following animals or things of that nature. And then the one that you might not think about is trying to use these platforms as research to understand things that we wouldn't want to understand with a human on the aircraft. So that fourth one is actually a small airframe that NASA uses to study loss of control. So what happens if the aircraft goes into some kind of flight path you're going to lose the aircraft and you may crash. You don't really want to study that thing with real people on board, but you can use these small aircraft to study some of those things. Here at our lab, I'll just say a few things that we work on. I mentioned we have a project on precision agriculture. We also have a project to study more flexible aircraft. That's what this aircraft is that's shown here. And again, this is just, it's something that you wouldn't want to study with a human on board. The purpose of this aircraft is to make a conventional aircraft more fuel efficient. You make it lighter, then the wings start vibrating and they can actually destroy themselves in flight. And in fact, we've destroyed an aircraft like this. If you fly it too fast, and the wings will kind of flutter apart. So you can use these aircraft for research purposes to do things that you wouldn't, as I mentioned, want to do with a manned aircraft. Now the challenges, I think there are many challenges. Volkan laid out several, so I'm going to hit on some of the same topics. The obstacle avoidance, I think the term sense and avoid is one that you'll hear frequently. How can you make an uninhabited aircraft sense other aircrafts or obstacles around it and then avoid it? The second thing is reliability and liability. These things are coupled together. But if something breaks on the aircraft, you want to make sure that you don't fly into somebody or hurt somebody. And there are questions of how much risk are we willing to take and what's the cost of avoiding that risk. And then there are all sorts of interesting questions about privacy that I think will come up throughout the panel. Okay. Just acknowledge there's a large group that we work with, so I'd just like to acknowledge the students that we work with and also our research staff, and then also our funding. And with that, I'll stop, just in the interest of time. Okay, so actually I didn't write down the order of the panel. So does it matter which order? It doesn't matter. Okay. I'll let you do it next.
Okay, I'm actually an entomologist, so I'm not in the development of these. I'm actually in the application of this technology in precision ag, trying to look at ways of more targeting precision of the material. So if in this presentation I seem to get really excited about insects, which is probably a really foreign concept for most of you, you have to remember to do my job, you have to be at least a half a bubble off plumb. I will tell you that there's an awful lot of adoption right now. It's rolling along very, very quickly. There are individual growers who have this material, who have this technology rather in hand, and they are flying it, and they've been doing it for at least 2 years. I was at a meeting, in fact I was talking to a chap this morning on my way down here. I stopped off and talked to a couple of people at a small meeting, and one of the things that happened was one of the local aviation guys came up to me and said, you know, I don't have a customer that does not own one of these UAVs, does not own a Phantom or something very small, and they're using it to look at their land. And the two most common uses are one, just to check whether or not the land is flooded in the spring, where we are, that's a big problem, and two, are there enough geese on the far side of the field to warrant me walking over there and going hunting this fall? The reason that I'm interested in this is because insects stress plants. Insect feeding stresses plants, and one of the responses when you do stress a plant is your chlorophyll decreases, and that also starts to change the structure inside your leaf. And that results in two things. Chlorophyll absorbs red light. So if you decrease the chlorophyll, you increase the amount of red light that is being reflected by that the plant is reflecting, because it's no longer being absorbed by the chlorophyll. The other thing is the structure of those cells on the inside of the leaf are responsible for reflecting near-infrared light, which is just beyond what we can see. And so we have a tendency to look at the wavelengths that will tell us whether or not we're dealing with a stress plant versus a non-stress plant. That actually is fairly straightforward, and I would imagine that when FAA regulations kind of clear the widespread adoption of UAVs, one of the first things we're going to see is this is going to be adopted into crop scouting. Now, if you drive around Minnesota early summer, one of the things you'll see is guys driving around, and there's a big four-wheeler in the back of their truck. And you might be thinking, that man is really paranoid about running out of gas, or having a flat tire. No, that guy's a crop scout. And the first thing he does when he arrives at a field is he unloads that four-wheeler and he drives across the field. And it takes him a long time. That's going to change. One of the first things that's going to happen when a crop scout arrives at a field in the near future is going to be, he's going to either look at an image of a field that's already been flown, or he'll fly it himself with a small UAV. Now, there are some bottlenecks to that, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen. This technology is going to change the way we grow food. It really is. The projects that we've been involved in, and I'm just going to go over them pretty quickly and show you some of the applications of this stuff. Soybean aphid. This is probably the number one insect pest, well, probably is the number one insect pest in soybean production in the northern states. And we've been looking at this for a couple of years now. It's part of the Precision Ag project. We work with the group at AEROELASTIC, and one of the things that we've done is we can find that, yeah, soybean aphid does change the spectral reflectance, the amount of light and wavelengths of light that are being reflected. And so we just published our first paper on that. That work is ongoing. So yeah, this technology does have a lot of promise in production. We've looked at sugar beet root maggot. This is a large, probably the most important insect pest of sugar beet production up in the Red River Valley, which is probably one of the it is the largest sugar beet production area in the country. And what we find is, yes, if you have large numbers if you have a large amount of damage on those sugar beet roots from root maggot, you're going to see a spectral response. You're going to see a lot less near-infrared reflected. So it's a very simple procedure. And then fly over it and look for that difference in reflection. And you can see it, especially compared to healthy plants. At the very bottom, these are plants that had very high sugar beet root maggot populations, a lot of stress. Look how much brighter the ones in the top are. That's near-infrared that you're looking at. By the way, if you looked at a picture of near-infrared, anybody care to guess what you'd see? Nothing. You can't see near-infrared. So when you see a near-infrared image like this, it's called false color. What we've done is we've blocked out one of the colors and we've assigned that wavelength to say, yeah, that's near-infrared. And it's usually one of the wavelengths we're not interested in. It's not really useful to say distress. In this case, it's red. Probably one of the real low-hanging fruit for the application of this is looking at defoliation from insects, because when they remove the leaves, they're gone. It's like the old joke, how do you know when an elephant has stolen your shoes? They're gone. I told that, yes, I know, but when my daughter was 6, that joke killed. So we do some work at Becker. We have COAs to operate our UAVs on all the research and outreach centers of the University of Minnesota. So we do work in many locations around the state. And this one is in Becker because they work with potatoes. And in potatoes is an insect, Colorado potato beetle. It's actually a beautiful bug. It's kind of this cream color with dark brown stripes. Half a bubble up plum. But that insect can defoliate a plant like no other insect I know. It's the ideal model to work with. It can take a plant right down to the stem in the matter of a week, or a number of them can. So we were out and actually doing visual inspections and evaluating the defoliation, or at least these undergraduates were, because when there's a lot of real nasty work to be done and trudging around the fields, we give it to them. But the software will actually then, you can train the software to look for what is vegetation, what is not vegetation, and that's kind of the result we'll get when we delineated out those middle 2 rows and said, okay, how much defoliation is there, how much canopy coverage do we have? And if you look at this over time, you can actually look at decreases or a steady state of canopy or increasing. So this is actually a really easy one to do. We'll be publishing this probably this year as well. Rhizoctonia crown root rot is a disease that gets into a number of plants, but it is a major plant disease in sugar beet root maggot. We had a graduate student a number of years ago who actually did work with a radiometer, which is a ground-based piece of information or equipment that actually looks at the different reflectance and wavelengths. And he said, yeah, we can see this, but it's late in the year. And it's kind of just before you can see it visibly. Not that useful as a management tool, because you have to treat this really early. So you can probably say, I know why you lost yield, but I don't think that's helpful to the producer. We were actually able to go out and use aerial photography and ground truth and say, yeah, we could. I don't have time to explain what we're looking at here, but we did actually, were able to look at high and low areas of disease. And some of the other diseases we're working on is potato virus Y, which is a very important disease in seed potatoes. It'll take a seed potato field, which is worth roughly in order of magnitude more than a commercial field. If you do not reach certification, and that means if more than 0.5% of the plants in your field are infected by PVY, you lose the ability to call it a certified seed field. And at that point in time, it becomes a commercial field. And so you go from a field that's worth tens of thousands to a field that's worth thousands. So it's a very important disease. And what makes it really, really interesting is that it's vectored by insects. That's the only saving grace, vectored by aphids. So again, if you look at a near-IR image of plants, if you look at PVY infected plants, they've got a much lower reflectance of that near-IR than the healthy uninfected plants. And the other one we're working on is that's a bacterial wheat streak on the right-hand side. And we've got some circles around these. You can see these areas in the middle, which are bright yellow, right? I wish I had thought to include the visual picture of this. It's solid green. There is no visible difference in those plots. They're all solid green. But those circles, those little hot spots in the middle, are actually where the graduate student went out and infected the plants the week before this was taken. So those plants are actually already infected with the bacterial disease, and they're already starting to show, the foliage is already starting to show a difference in the amount of near-IR that they're reflecting. This is an extraordinarily powerful tool. So the use of UAVs in precision ag is really advancing stuff that we have been working on for a long, long time. One of the bottlenecks to getting precision ag into place, and precision ag is, if you have to go out and treat something now, you treat the whole field, regardless of how many plants are out there infected. If you're over threshold and you need to treat, you have to treat the whole field, because that's the equipment we have. In the future, we're not going to be there. In the future, what we're going to be doing is treating the areas in the field that only need treating, and that's it. And that is an incredible benefit, ecologically and economically. We're going to be much more sustainable. But yeah, the use of UAVs, I don't call them drones, not because of drone strikes. A drone is a male bee, it just gets confusing. So yeah, the use of this technology is going to change everything.
So I'm next. My name is Jennifer Alexander. I'm in the Department of Mechanical Engineering in the program for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, as Jennifer introduced us all earlier. So I'm going to make a few comments on the ethics of drones. This is what I've been tasked with. And I feel empowered in what I want to say by the success of the recent novel by Anthony Doerr, All the Light We Cannot See, the recent Pulitzer Prize winner. Has anyone read it? A few of you have read it. It involves a radio engineer. And I'll say something in the end about the epigram that starts the book. The point I want to make today is something that I've talked to Paul Strakowski about in the College of Science and Engineering, and talked to my colleagues in mechanical engineering about, which is the relative absence of engineers and people with technical backgrounds and technical experience in our systems of government. Because I think one of the ways to approach questions like the UAVs, UASs, and their ethical issues is to ask at what point are decisions made about them. And I think most of our ethical discussion, and I have spent the last few weeks, well, it's actually been nearly a month and a half, combing through literature about the ethics of drones, the ethics of UAVs. And I think it uniformly suffers from a very serious problem, which is uniformly the distinction is made between fact and value. Do all of you recognize this? This is a classic ethical distinction between what is and what ought to be. A classic ethical distinction dating from David Hume, G.E. Moore in the 20th century, the philosopher was particularly interested in this. And what I think we need to do is not just about UAVs. I'll have a couple very specific empirical examples to mention, but what I think is really necessary ethically is to begin to dissolve that distinction, to say that even the technical has an ethical value, it has an ethical presence. Even the technical has an ethical presence. So let me mention a couple of particular examples, particular empirical studies that are not mine. One of them comes from Mike, is he happen to be here by any chance? Mike Dittmer of the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife and Conservation Biology here at Minnesota, who's done some very interesting work. He's for some time been studying bears and their response to various kinds of interruptions in their habitat, and recently published a piece that got a lot of airplay and newspaper play over the summer about the reaction of bears to UAVs invading their territory. He found that only one of 18 flights and 18 experiences with the bears that he studied, in only one of them was there a behavioral response to the drones. In only one of them. But he was able to, he had fitted them with collars for logging bioinformation, and he found that uniformly, even though only one bear dashed, and I'll say something about that in a minute, even though only one bear dashed, uniformly their heart rates exhibited significant stress. Up to 132, 123 beats per minute above baseline in reaction. And the one bear that exhibited a behavioral response was a female bear who left her territory and dashed into neighboring territory in which she had never been recorded as having been in that territory. So a pretty significant response. So even though there was not a behavioral response, there was a significant response by the creature to that stress in its environment. The second example is, there's a bit of charm to the thought of bears. You know, they're a lovely, charismatic animal. The next example comes from Yemen. And a study from last year of the psychological effects of more than 10 years of drone warfare in Yemen, published by the Al-Karama Institute in Geneva, in which families were interviewed, showing significant levels of post-traumatic stress syndrome, including fear of sleeping and trouble sleeping, jumpiness, fear of going outside, and uniformly in the girls who were interviewed, 100% in the girls who were interviewed, when drones were mentioned and pictures were given, they responded with examples of extreme stress, with fright, with anger, with tears. So the psychological reactions. Some of them had families who had experienced or lost loved ones to strikes. Others had only heard about it, hadn't physically been impacted. Nonetheless, there was a significant increase in stress responses, even at the mention of this type of experience. At the mention of not this type of experience, let me be clear. At the mention of this object, this gadget, at the mention of these technologies. At the mention of these technologies. So what a UAV allows is action at a distance. Action at a distance. And it immeasurably increases the power of whatever arm wields it. It increases that power and it lets that power take physical effect somewhere else. Take physical effect somewhere else. And so technically, I think that is a technical issue. And I don't think that is dissolved from the issue of the ethics of its use, or of the or consequences. I think those technical issues can be. We should find a way. I should say. I don't know how we do it yet. We should find a way to take the technical capacities quite seriously, And Pete, you're talking about autonomy, the possibility of the craft having some kind of autonomy. And it seems to me that's a technical issue, how that is achieved. But there are decision trees that would be built into it. And even if you think of it in a military situation, and we've had very charming examples. We haven't had military examples other than the 2 photos you showed us. We haven't had military examples today. But even in a military case, were there to be some autonomy, there would be a point at which it's technical to decide what counts as a target, to decide how to distinguish between civilians and combatants, or to decide if the damage that's going to be inflicted, even damage to civilians, is proportionally worth doing compared to the value of the strike, the military strike itself. If they're going to be autonomous, if the craft are going to be designed to take actions autonomously, there are going to be people with technical skills who build that in. And so I think UAVs, just because they have these wonderful, delightful uses. I was saying to Ian, I loved that video of the little, was it a soybean field that you were showing us out on the plaza? The little thing going over the soybean field? That is delightful. That is a delight. And it has uses that seriously can affect our ability to feed ourselves. Right? So serious and valuable possibilities. So I think UAVs, because of those serious and valuable possibilities, they give us a really good place to talk about the technical as having ethical implications. And so I'll close just by returning to all the light they cannot see, and I hope many of you will read it. The epigram, and I thought very hard about whether I should speak about this or not, but I will. The epigram is a quotation from Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, that says, "Without radio, we could not have achieved what the Nazi Reich has achieved." So it's an inflammatory statement for me to refer to now. I'm not saying that what we're talking about today has that kind of implication, although for many Yemenis they would wonder. There's also been work done in Pakistan along similar lines, for example, at NYU and Stanford. But what that epigram says, and I think this is part of the reason that that book has become so popular, it suggests exactly this collapsing of that dichotomy. That the radio engineer, who is one of the central characters, is propping up, is assisting a regime through his technical work. And it's how he comes to question his technical work. How he comes to question it. And to take his own ethical responsibility for the technical itself. And so I think UAVs, because of these, I'm sorry, I don't mean to diminish it by calling it charming. I don't mean that at all. I should emphasize instead that sense of delight. And I think that sense of wonder. I know Dimas has said that, it is the golden age. Do some of you feel that way? It's the golden age of UAVs. So many possibilities. It's a wide open field. So I think we also have the opportunity to look at it as having built-in ethical possibilities, ethical standards, ethical values. So, thank you.
You want to go?
You know what?
Let me go to I'm going to respond pretty directly to her,
Awesome.
and you can speed the queen up. Great.
Great.
Okay. Good.
We'll see that. Hi, I'm Bill McGeveran. I'm a law professor here at the U, and I'm a fellow of the IAS. I'm going to tell you 3 things about the law and UAVs. And I think the reason maybe I should go next is that some of it intersects very well with what Jennifer was talking about from an ethical frame. So 3 things I'm going to tell you about are the danger of caricatures. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that the law is already here when it comes to UAVs. And the third thing I'm going to tell you is that not all UAVs are created equal. Those are all important concepts here. So the first is about the danger of caricatures. This is really just to frame what we're talking about. But I do find when the discussion turns to I'm a privacy specialist, so that's my main focus here. When the discussion turns to UAVs or drones, as some people will call them, you often see 2 caricatures emerge in the way people are talking about them, both of which I think are hazardous caricatures. One is something that Julie Cohen, who's a legal scholar, has called the Luddism proviso. And it's related to something you were talking about, Jennifer. It's this idea that technology is this neutral force that is marching forward, and that responses to think about it in a way that might restrain or restrict what the technology does on its own are wrong-headed examples of Luddism. They're sort of anti-technology, anti-progress. And that's a false technological neutrality that doesn't recognize that technology is not a force of nature, it's constructed. People build it. We build it and we make decisions about how it ought to get built. So that caricature comes from one end. The other caricature is something that I call it the caricature of creepy triggers, right? So there is a lot of discussion about UAVs and privacy. Every person who gets up here to talk about it has to acknowledge that privacy is, of course, an issue we need to discuss. But you know, there's a lot of cameras in our world. They're everywhere. And you do not have the same, you have some, but you do not by any means have the same level of public alarm about cameras that stay on the ground. Right? Cameras that are stuck into buildings, cameras that don't have some of the same effects, people don't get as worried about. There are some reasonable reasons for that. But part of the degree of the response to this and the way that the law is potentially going to react could be an overreaction based actually in alarm at what is novel, right? The fact that this is a camera that flies in, you know, a machine that looks maybe a little bit menacing. If you want to make a sci-fi movie about the quadcopter, you can make it look like a sinister thing pretty easily. And I think some of the emotional response we need to recognize for what it is and think carefully about really what is different about this machine. And there are some differences, but we need to be careful and not give into caricatures in how we think about those differences. So that's one. The second thing I want to say is that the law is already here. You will hear some people, not my esteemed co-panelists, but some people who are enthusiastic about this golden age, act as if they are writing when it comes to law or policy on a totally blank slate. Right? We should figure out how we are going to handle these things in the law, they will say. But that's kind of silly, right? Actually, the law is already here, was my second point. Now, even the golden age enthusiasts will recognize that that pesky FAA is already here, right? The FAA is regulating drones and UAVs and UASs, and it's going to be continue to do so, and that's a really important operating space. When it comes to privacy, there's all kinds of laws that a UAV operating in a certain way could violate right now, today. They're not special UAV laws, they're general privacy laws. There are things like the tort of intrusion on seclusion, which is fancy talk for you can get sued if you're a peeping Tom. Right? And that tort has existed for decades and comes up in all kinds of scenarios, from the peeping Tom to harassing phone calls to people who are bothering you in social media in a way that's unreasonably intrusive. Right? You can be liable for doing that. And so some misuses of UAVs that are privacy concerns, we have a law that exists. There's also law that's designed to deal with paparazzi photographers, right? And a lot of those laws came into being after the death of Princess Diana from some very zealous paparazzi in a chase car, but they've been around for a long time, they've been developing. There's lots of situations where law that was meant to be aimed at celebrity photographers could in fact end up covering privacy invasive misuses of UAVs. So the law is already here, and today's rules are going to continue to evolve, of course, but we shouldn't be thinking of this as some kind of blank slate. We have law, and we will continue to have law in the area. So as I said, the third thing, that not all UAVs are created equal. I think it's problematic to talk about privacy and UAVs as if it's one monolithic topic. It matters a ton what you were doing, how you were using it, and what kind of consent from the individuals you might have, right? And having overly broad blanket privacy rules for all UAVs will probably not be suitable. So, to take a couple specific examples, I think a lot of times people talk about rules for all UAVs when what they're really thinking about is government use of UAVs for surveillance, potential surveillance purposes, right? And there's already a bunch of law about that. The US legal culture and certainly privacy law looks a lot, with a lot more care towards government obtention of information than private sector obtention of information. We have a Fourth Amendment, the police can't come in your house without search warrants. The Supreme Court has made a number of rulings recently extending older principles into new areas of technology and being pretty aggressive about doing it. So they found that the police had to have a search warrant to use a GPS tracker to track a suspect's car for a month. And so they sort of said, look, we could follow this person around in public streets without getting a search warrant. We should be able to use this technology to do that. And the Supreme Court, 9-zip, said, no, you can't. You have to have a warrant. Likewise, the Supreme Court, even more recently, just 18 months ago, had a decision that said that you couldn't just search the content of an arrestee's smartphone. And the law enforcement authorities that had done that said, well, you know, we can search the person of someone we've put under arrest and look at the, you know, in the old mystery movies where there's always a matchbook that tells you where they've been, right? You know, that kind of thing, with a phone number written inside, right, of the bad guy, right? But they were able to scrutinize the material that was found on the person of someone that they arrested. The Supreme Court said, well, that's fine, but looking inside someone's smartphone is a categorical difference from it, right? So the Supreme Court's working on this. There's lots of concerns about UAVs and government use, but we shouldn't then be talking about some of these many other applications through the same lens. It's a totally different set of problems. And those problems need to be thought about quite specifically in terms of, you know, words like Latin, right? Cui bono, like who benefits from the use of this UAV in this situation? Who's the beneficiary? And it's quite different to say, what are the privacy concerns of a farmer's use of a sensor over his or her own land, right? Where, after all, anyone who's captured would have been equally subject to being captured by if they had a camera on the ground in their own land. Like, that's really different than a scenario people might be imagining, which I think is a real scenario we need to think about UAVs being used by paparazzi photographers to, you know, try and get pictures of Selena Gomez topless from a few hundred feet in the air, right? Where a place where a camera couldn't have got put before at a reasonable price, and now they can. So those are not two situations that should be handled in the same logic. What I'm seeing out there is a lot of people treating all UAVs and all applications of them alike, when nothing could be further from the truth. They're all different from each other. So those are my three contributions, and I think that all of them point to one unifying principle, which is thinking in a concrete, specific, applied way about what the rules of the road or the sky ought to be for this kind of technology. And having responses that are not grounded in caricature, they're not pretending we're writing on a blank slate, and most of all, they're thinking about the specific privacy concerns of the situation at hand. And I'm hoping that that's the way things are going to go. Thanks.
So I always learn something when I set foot on the University of Minnesota campus, and today I learned that you should always defer to a fellow, because that was actually a perfect bridge to a couple of slides that I have. So worked out exceptionally well. So as a reminder, I'm Cassandra Isackson. I'm the Director of Aeronautics for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I know most folks think of us as snowplows and highway cones, and we certainly do a lot of that. But we actually have a role in virtually every mode of transportation, whether it's ports or railroads, airports, and so on. And so I do have a couple of slides. Let's see if I can get this right. There we go. So in MnDOT, we say unmanned aircraft system, and I realize that that's not quite as nice of a term, the unmanned piece, but the reality is that's how the Federal Aviation Administration defines it, so that's how we do as well. There are basically three kinds. Public, meaning governmental. So if the Minnesota Department of Transportation were to use a UAS, were to own one, it would be a government purpose. It would be a governmental use. If a law enforcement agency were to use one, the FBI were, governmental. Non-governmental is pretty much everyone else. So stuff that the university does, governmental, because universities, public university falls under that. But non-governmental is what you would typically think of as Amazon, businesses, farmers, all of those folks. And then there's model aircraft. And talking about existing laws, a lot of I hear many people in the conversation about UAS say, well, we're waiting on FAA to develop regulations. The reality is there's more regulations than you can imagine. The FAA regulates aircraft, airmen, and airspace, all three, and they have piles and piles and piles of regulations. Historically, what FAA has said, if you have a model aircraft, what we used to call RC, or radio control, I mean, they've been in existence since aircraft have been in existence. FAA said, all these regulations, if you're just out, you've got a hobby, radio-controlled aircraft, you don't need to abide by those. The fact that FAA's position is that they have the authority to tell you you have an exception means that they regulate it. So it's already regulated. It's basically been regulated by exception. The FAA Modernization Act that occurred in 2012, Congress mandated that FAA get to a place where we can integrate commercial use of UAS in the nation's airspace. So that's really what they've been working on, trying to figure out which of all the things they've said you're exempted from, now they need to pull some of those back and say, well, except for these things. These are the things that if you're going to operate in the airspace with aircraft that have people on it, there are some things, some rules you got to follow and all that. So that's really where those things are. Nope. Maybe down. Here, we'll do it this way. So, hobby, we direct everyone, knowbeforeyouFly.org. FAA, model aircraft, UAS organizations collaborated on this. If you're not sure what you are, if you're a farmer and you're flying your field, you're probably not a hobby. KnowbeforeyouFly.org can help you figure that out. And then there are some rules. These are the things that FAA says. Stay below 400 feet. Line of sight. You have to be able to see it at all times. You need to stay away from airports in general. Stay away from people, things like that. There's actual law. This is that Modernization Act I mentioned on that. Civil operations. So if you're wanting to use a UAS for, let's say you're a real estate agent, you're a wedding photographer, any of the activities you could think of, you contact FAA, you need to get a COA, you need to get a Section 333 exemption, and in some instances, a special airworthiness certificate. You also, if you are in the state of Minnesota, you need to contact us. In Minnesota, we have historically viewed we have a nice definition of aircraft, pretty much anything that flies, known or unknown. So it is a very broad definition developed back in the day. And so it pretty much covered anything that might ever, anyone can conceive of. And typically what we require is that you register your aircraft, there's a tax associated with that. So just like you get license tabs for your car, if you have a plane in the state of Minnesota, you have to pay aircraft registration tax, you have to register it. I recently had to register my canoe, so I get it. I know what that, DNR has canoe registration. I learned that. But what we've typically looked at is if FAA assigns an N number or a tail number to an aircraft, then we view that as an aircraft in need of registration. For all of those business, aviation, commercial, all those kinds of things that are not a hobby, FAA has been giving them N numbers. So we've been reaching out saying, hey, you got to come register with us. We also have something called a commercial operator's license that's required. Both of those things, and Minnesota is unique in this, The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, just issued a report this last week, and we're unique. We require liability insurance. So aircraft owners in the state of Minnesota have to have liability insurance. Commercial operators have to have liability insurance. So the companies in Minnesota that have registered with us, those UAS, they have liability insurance. And so most states do not require aircraft owners, the vast majority of states do not require that liability insurance piece. So there are things that can manage some of the issues that people have. It's just a matter of knowing when to apply it, how to apply it, having the big public conversations about it. There are fines and misdemeanors out there for people who violate. We've been sending some cease and desist letters. We've been ramping up as we've been doing more educating. But we certainly see the good. We've been calling it the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because we see on the one hand, we want to see the industry advance. We think there's a lot of good in it. But we also see safety issues. Many people think about airports and they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Don't fly near an airport. Where's the nearest hospital from here? How do you know there's not a helicopter that's landing on the roof of that hospital? You know, those kinds of things most people don't think about. And helicopters are operating in the same space below 400 feet that many UAS is. So there's a lot of aviation issues that we're trying to work through. But with that, that's all I have. I think there's probably going to have a Q&A. So.
One application that hasn't, as far as I can tell, been addressed. We have purchased a UAV in the College of Liberal Arts in an exploratory manner. What does it mean to use it for liberal arts education? We don't know yet what that means, and our department was one of the co-sponsors I heard here. We're interested in the photography aspect of it, just as a, really high-resolution photographs and video available through this, vehicle that can give us access to spaces that we've never done before. And it intrudes on all these other things, privacy potentially being one, aerospace being another, what are the commercial applications of these photographs and video that we do. So, but it's all, it just feels unmanaged at this point, or unknown, shouldn't we be allowed to explore, but then, in other words, does art have a different kind of a master, I guess? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, some of you may have seen recently, there was some reports in the news, the Starts Tribune, NPR covered it. I believe it's the Minneapolis Institute of Art is doing some crop artwork, and they were using UAS as part of it. There was a follow-up story to that, and the follow-up story was that we sent them a cease and desist letter. And the reason we did, it's not that they can't do it, it's that they had not gone to FAA, gotten their COA, they had not come to us, registered that, because they weren't engaged in a hobby. They weren't engaged in what FAA has typically put it. It's not that they can't do it, they just needed to do it in a certain way. And it just so happened that they're in the approach to Minneapolis-St. Paul. And several of us saw the reports, and they even talked about how they were taking their photographs in between the 90 seconds that the planes come by. And so it's that kind of, there's a lot of people, they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
They just don't know what they don't know.
But the purpose of that crop was to be seen by planes.
Right.
So, you can't...
And so, so it's not like that they can't do it, it's just that you need to follow the legal framework that exists to do it.
And if you give her your card afterwards, she can send you a nice letter soon. No.
We have an attorney that does this.
I think this raises a question we didn't talk about quite so much, which is the issue of safety and sort of the, how people are looking at the assessment of risk, particularly as the technology proliferates, and how the designers and the application designers think about those issues of safety as well.
So I'll say a little bit about that. So on commercial aircraft, generally the levels of reliability that you try to achieve are 1 catastrophic failure every 10 to the 9th hours. So every billion hours, there's a probability that the airplane could fall out of the sky. And so that's what we've decided is a reasonable level of risk for a commercial aircraft with possibly hundreds of people on the airplane. And so that really drives a lot of the cost in the aircraft itself. It's not building the airframe, it's all the redundancy behind the scenes and making sure the airplane's going to keep flying no matter what breaks. And so I think the question for these smaller aircraft is what's the level of risk we're willing to accept? And then there's some economic consequence to design in enough redundancy or reliability into the aircraft.
So that actually dovetails well with what I'm going to ask because it gets to the idea of cost. And I hate to ask the depressing question, but something that didn't come up during the legal conversation is laws of war do things like have prohibitions against targeting civilians, right? The deliberate targeting of civilians, and there's all kinds of stuff about state of war versus not a state of war, declared war versus not a declared war. UAVs obviously allow those boundaries to be expanded or contracted in different ways. But what's also intriguing to me is that there haven't been a whole lot of studies about whether or not UAVs actually reduce the cost of targeting the type of people that militaries target, right? And what's interesting, or what I would actually like to hear discussed a little bit, is what kind of conversations are going on in the legal field about these types of things, but also from the ethical aspect of design and engineering. One of the things that has come up is what it means to be someone piloting one of these remotely and not having sort of the technological closeness that a pilot has to make last-minute decisions in the same type of way, but also how, again, the human costs are being calculated. Because it is different. Boots on the ground calculations are incredibly distinct from PTSD in a bunker outside of DC calculations. So if both of you could talk a little more about that and how that is intersected with technological development, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I don't know what exactly a study would be about the costs, but it's Joint Chiefs of Staff reports, they simply say, we are saving a lot of bodies and we're saving a lot of money. They just say that, and I haven't followed the footnotes to see exactly, but it seems so obvious. Maybe I should follow the footnotes, but it just seems so obvious. They're not flying something, disposable in a way, a disposable aircraft, and out it goes. And hopefully it does what it doesn't, comes back and gets to go again, but much, much cheaper. What people have been talking about is the Star Trek effect, a taste of Armageddon. This is the episode from one of the series of Star Trek where the people are two planets, I think it's 2 planets anyway, 2 civilizations at war, and war is too bloody and messy, so they've devised this algorithm that they have this war via computer, and then some of them have to go in and be vaporized in a little room, in a little closet, but so that they avoid the blood and mess of war. And so they've been going on for centuries with this very sanitized sort of war. And so one of the things that people are talking about is not so much for the operator in the room, but in general, making of war without having any of those bodily physical risks. And so the question that's being asked by ethicists is, does that prolong war? Does it make it easier to get, and that's war. Let's not say war, because that has a specific legal status. Let's say, does it prolong
Conflict.
Armed conflict.
Prolong conflict? Does it make it easier to get into conflict? So this is the kind of question that people are asking right now. And the preliminary answer is maybe it does, because the costs, the actual equipment costs, the physical costs to the boots on the ground is the phrase you used, the physical costs to whoever is perpetrating the act of aggression, and I don't mean that in terms of causing war, I mean the physically effective act that's being done. So the PTSD of the person who's running it like a video game, there is concern about that, and that is not a literature that I'm familiar with. But there is quite a bit of concern, and I know there are a number of people who've been talking about that. Maybe.
Yeah, so this is not my field, but I will plug one of my colleagues and tell you what he's been working on. So Oren Gross, who's also on the faculty of the law school and is an internationally known scholar of law of war, has actually been writing very much about technological development in warfare and how it intersects with traditional laws of war. He has a recent paper that he's written it's called, is there, I might be getting the title slightly wrong, but it's basically, is there a duty to use drones? And his concern or argument, or what he's exploring, is the extent to which certain duties to mitigate possibility of harm that you have as a party in conflict might actually create obligations to use unmanned vehicles in situations exactly because of some of the duties you have in terms of civilians and other things, and then potentially lead to some of the concerns that Jennifer's raising. So since this is something that interests you, I'd encourage you to look up his work.
I guess I want to follow up on your question and bring back in philosophy and ethics into this question. And just, I don't know how many people have read Simondon, of the Canadian philosopher, who in the 60s already argued that the question of bringing the human and technology back together again was like the biggest question in the face of new technologies in the post-industrial age. That is sort of equivalent to the kinds of questions that philosophers faced with the abolition of slavery. And so what I guess the question I want to ask is, if we think about unmanned, uninhabited aerial vehicles, drones, and I thought it was interesting how many people said, I don't use the word drone, which is a kind of a sleight of hand that I think is important to notice. And I guess the question that I have is, what are the consequences of becoming the subjects of a drone state for the state's own population, so for us here? And I guess I want to ask that in terms of intellectual maneuvers and the semantic coups that we deal with when we talk about drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. Consequences for our disciplines, consequences for ethics, for the law, etc. I think, just to give you an example, one of the things that's changed in international warfare as a result of drones is that warfare is no longer about combat, but it's about manhunts. And if I remember correctly, the last time we had manhunts was during slavery. And so I just want to bring that into the conversation.
Well, the use of the term drone is interesting. So I was asking Jennifer Gunn, saying, why, we sort of have it as a law that in this panel we are going to say UAVs instead of drones, because drones carries a very specific connotation, and it isn't just the male being. It carries that connotation of something that's just going to go do what it's going to do without anything interrupting it. It has that just, and it's a very specific connotation, and I think that's why some people don't want to call them. Is that right? You don't want to call it a drone?
I mean, I think in the research, you want to take this one, Volkan, or no?
It's all right.
Nice try, though. That was good.
I mean, I think for me personally, yeah, it brings to mind predators, and we're going to shoot missiles at people, and there's a semantic thing that, no one, I shouldn't say no one, I don't necessarily want to feel like that's what I'm building my research around,
I would say it does plug into the characters exactly. I do think that there's the sort of mindlessness of it, I think, is important. And of course, a bunch of us talked about the difference between autonomous and pilot-controlled aircraft. And to my mind, a real drone, and by the way, we may be moving towards more of these, including in warfare situations, which is one thing that a lot of people are paying attention to, are so autonomous that there isn't anyone on the joystick back home, right? And that to me is what really ought to be called a drone. Most of what these agricultural or pipeline safety or climate change mapping or oceanography applications are not that. They're actually being piloted in a line of sight, and they're not drones in the sense that they're doing their own thing. So if I could be the linguistic tyrant, I would make us all save the word drone for those particular situations, and in fact, frankly, the places where they are most likely to cause concern are in war and conflict situations, and then also maybe in safety concerns. Saying something that really is autonomous could raise us to be more cautious about safety.
I think also in the industry, when you start talking to people who are designing these and building them and selling them, I think the connotation of drone perhaps infers that they're a less intelligent
Right.
vehicle. And so, if it's an uninhabited aerial system, that sounds like it's, I don't know, has better cachet anyway. Certainly the drone does. So I think a lot of that, when I first started kind of working with these things, what I noticed was that the term UAS and UAV was coming more out of industry than it was out of, out of any other lexicon.
This is like the difference between autonomous weapons and killer robots. Like Charlie Carpenter studies this, and this comes up with like, are we going to have the robots with the tread vehicles and the weapons attached to them, and are they autonomous systems or are they killer robots? And the answer is they're both, but how people choose to use that does have political connotations.
As language always does, of course.
It doesn't go quickly to artificial intelligence. I mean, that's what I think it's what we're really afraid of. It's not the eye in the sky. It's anything that we can't control.
I think for me, so being in the transportation agency, I'm sure many of you have seen the driverless cars, the Googles involved. And so we have conversations around UAS that we don't seem to have around driverless cars. And so from, they always say where you stand depends on where you sit. And sitting in a transportation agency, we tend to look at these as part of a transportation system and a transportation network. And, so I find it interesting, and I think part of it is the history of the use of UAS by military, by things like that. It brings with it, we don't have the same sort of history with driverless cars.
That's true. Yet.
I think it's an association thing in the sense that I have colleagues who work on building these big aerial vehicles that even if they hit your face, they're not going to do anything, and then autonomy associated with this. Whereas I think in the public circles, the way these things come up is mainly in the military context and so on. And I think part of it is a way of saying no, that's not what we're doing. These are the kinds of things. The other thing I want to add, I'm actually glad that we brought up the autonomous cars, is even with our regular cars, the amount of autonomy, we usually are not aware of it, but when you step on the gas or step on the brake, it actually does go through a computer, and the computer makes a lot of decisions, or we have the cruise control and all those kinds of things. So I think, these are all very big questions that they have to be investigated, maybe different dimensions. There's the intelligence, whatever that means, there's the autonomy, there's the actual sort of the action that, whether you can shoot something, is it the same as, just taking some pictures, which could be because you could literally fly into an airplane and then take it down with a simple orbital and so on. But I think for the discussions, it's important to identify these different dimensions of the problem.
It's interesting you mentioned the computer system in cars. There's law and there's case law, and that's an example of where oftentimes there have been people who have been in automobile crashes, and the automobile manufacturer reaches in and pulls that data to show that they're not at fault, and there's all this, you can't do that, this is my data, it's my car, and there's a lot of court cases around, it's not really your data. They do allow the automobile, and so it's interesting that, and I think that as UAS is used, collecting data more and more, there'll be some of those kinds of conversations too, that data ownership is complex.
I completely agree with you. It's one of the things I sort of skipped in my talk in the interest of time, but I do think that UAVs are part of a larger phenomenon that of what some people call the Internet of Things. But so especially when they're networked, but even when they're not, the more sensors are out there collecting the more information, the more there is known and knowable about everyone and everything. And at least sometimes, 99.9% of the time, no one's going to go look to find out. But if you get in a crash, or if you are a famous celebrity, or in various other circumstances, suddenly data that is brought into existence by the fact that we have all of these machines, then can threaten privacy.
So I just want to maybe do a quick time check. It's 5:25. Do we want to do 5 more minutes and then wrap up?
And then adjourn downstairs?
Yeah, maybe one more question, then any closing thoughts, I guess, from the panel. If there's any more questions?
What what would be the biggest change you can expect when UAV becomes like your personal car that everybody owns it? Maybe some household has even 2 or 3.
That is the biggest change I can see. Yeah, I mean, they're going to become omnipresent. We're seeing more and more of them in various industries, especially in Europe, more so in Canada. I don't know if you're aware, anybody had heard, Amazon moved their research for their delivery system to Canada. And they're in southern British Columbia, apparently only 2,000 feet from the border. Now, if that's not thumbing your nose at somebody. But, you know, in a variety of different countries have very different laws on it. Some are even more restrictive than the United States, some are much more open. And you're starting to see, in those countries where it's very open, you're starting to see incorporation of these vehicles more and more into people's daily lives. There's a great YouTube out, there's a suggested use for them in the Netherlands of dispatching these, the automated defibrillators, you know. And there'll be somebody on the other end who's talking to you. You know, if you call into 911 and somebody is, you know, is having a heart attack and is dropped to the floor, you can call 911 and they send one of these things to you. And the operator is talking to you over a radio link and a speaker and microphone system. There's actually a very good YouTube on it out there. And at this point, it's just a suggestion, but yeah, I could see that as probably somewhere where they would likely be adopted. So yeah, the one thing you can always be sure of in technology is it's going to get smaller and it's going to get cheaper. And I mean, I remember when I came to Minnesota 18 years ago, a cell phone was something that you had in a bag and you left in your car. And boy, they sure didn't take pictures. But now, I mean, we carry in our pockets something that, you know, has more computing power than the best laptops did 15 years ago. So,
I think it's hard, you know, from working in government, it's hard to predict kind of what that future looks like and what it means. You know, there was a time period where the city of New York was absolutely consumed with an issue. Politicians talked about it. There was articles in the newspaper. It was all consuming. They were being overwhelmed with horse manure. They had to cart it out of the city. What are we going to do? It was impacting every New Yorker's quality of life. Henry Ford comes along and boom, issue's gone. It's not even, you know, all of a sudden there's this whole other area of issue and concern that it never even occurred to them to think about. And I think that technology does that for sure.
yeah.
Okay, so I think that maybe is a good spot to wrap up, and we can thank the panel and also thank the audience for the good questions.
Thank you all very much, and I hope you'll join us downstairs on the west side of the building on the first floor at Certix Cafe.